When a case reaches day 75 without resolution, the question is no longer just what happened. The question becomes why. At this point, with these resources, with this level of federal involvement, and with this much sustained national attention, an answer has not yet arrived. And in the Nancy Guthrie abduction case, that question has more than one uncomfortable answer when you look at it carefully. This is not a case that has been ignored or under-resourced by the standards of American law enforcement. Federal resources entered the case early. The FBI has been involved. The national media has sustained its attention. A ransom note was recovered. A second ransom note has since emerged. DNA evidence has been collected. And now, at the end of 75 days, the most potentially significant forensic development in the case is inside a federal laboratory, waiting on a scientific process that does not move faster simply because anyone wants it to. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance and the investigation that followed is in many respects a study in how an American law enforcement response to a high-profile abduction actually functions. Not how it is depicted in dramatic recreations, not how press releases describe it, how it actually works with all of its complexity, its interdependencies, its points of institutional friction, and its points of genuine capability. This analysis examines that functioning in detail. The evidence, the forensic process, and what it realistically can produce. The institutional dynamics that are adding friction to a case that already has enough of it. The question of the second ransom note and what its emergence tells us, and an honest assessment of what the realistic outlook for resolution looks like from where things stand today. That is what this analysis is designed to do, not to generate reaction, but to generate understanding, because understanding is what a case like this one deserves. Begin with the evidence, because that is where any honest assessment of this case has to start. Evidence is where certainty, however partial and provisional, actually lives. Hair samples were recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. The precise circumstances of their collection, whether they were gathered in the initial processing of the residence early in the investigation or identified during a more recent and intensive re-examination, have not been fully disclosed. What is known is that they were identified as potentially critical by investigators at a point when that characterization was apparently not warranted by earlier assessments of the same or similar material. When law enforcement elevates physical evidence to the category of critical during an active investigation, it reflects a judgment that the material has a direct bearing on suspect identification, not a possible bearing, not a circumstantial connection, a direct potential link to the person responsible. Those samples are now in an FBI laboratory. The analysis is ongoing. It has been complicated, and this is a significant complication by what sources describe as mixed DNA results. A mixed profile is a result where the genetic material of more than one individual is present in the extracted sample. In a residential setting, this is entirely predictable. Homes are not forensic clean rooms. They accumulate biological material from every person who has spent time in them, sometimes over years. The presence of multiple genetic profiles in hair samples collected from the inside of a lived-in home does not represent contamination or analytical failure. It represents the physical reality of the environment from which the material was collected. What it does represent, procedurally, is a significantly more demanding analytical challenge. Resolving a mixed DNA profile requires what is called probabilistic genotyping, a computational statistical method that uses mathematical modeling to estimate the probability that any specific individual contributed to the mixture. The process evaluates all possible combinations of individual profiles that could collectively produce the observed genetic signature and assigns probability values to each scenario. This allows investigators to determine with a calculable statistical confidence whether a specific person of interest is a likely contributor to the mixed sample. The FBI's forensic laboratory system uses the most advanced probabilistic genotyping software currently available to law enforcement. Results generated through this process are accepted in federal courts and have formed the evidentiary basis of successful prosecutions in the United States and internationally. But the process is not fast, and it cannot be made fast without compromising the accuracy of the result. The accuracy of the result is not a secondary consideration. In a case that will eventually reach prosecution, a DNA analysis that cannot withstand scientific cross-examination is worse than no analysis at all. Beyond the probabilistic genotyping itself, the process requires comparison samples. The mathematical modeling of a mixed profile is most useful when investigators have reference DNA from specific individuals against whose profiles the mixture can be tested. Without those comparison samples, the analysis can produce a deduced profile, a best estimate of who might have been present, but it cannot link that profile to a named, identified person. The collection of comparison samples from persons of interest in an investigation is a strategic decision with operational implications. If a potential suspect learns that investigators have sought their DNA for comparison, they know how close they are to identification. That knowledge can cause flight, can create legal complications, and can affect the broader investigative posture. The timing of that collection is deliberate and is not communicated publicly. What the delay in the analysis tells a careful observer is that the process is being done correctly. That is both reassuring and difficult to sit with simultaneously, because it means the timeline is governed entirely by the demands of the science. And the science is not responsive to anyone's sense of urgency. Now the institutional failure, and it must be named directly because naming it is the honest thing to do. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is the local agency with primary jurisdiction over the Nancy Guthrie investigation. It has been the public face of the local law enforcement response since the beginning. And this week, its conduct generated a story that does not reflect well on the department in any reading of the available facts. An alert was sent to the public. The alert contained the message that Nancy Guthrie had been located. The words were simple, direct, and carried a meaning that required no interpretation. She had been found. The search was over. In the context of an investigation that has been watched by a national audience for more than 10 weeks, and in which the outcome for a specific living person is what is at stake, those words produced a specific and powerful response. People received the news. They processed it as news. They experienced, however briefly, a form of resolution to a situation that has been unresolved and distressing for a very long time. The alert was not true in the way it was universally received. What actually happened and what the alert was actually intended to communicate has not been fully and satisfactorily explained by the department. A correction was issued. The correction acknowledged that the alert had created a misunderstanding. What it did not provide was a transparent accounting of how a message of that specificity and that emotional significance cleared whatever review process exists within the department before being distributed to the public. That accounting has not come. In the architecture of trust between law enforcement and the public it serves, this incident represents a failure at a moment when that trust is most needed and most fragile. People who have been holding this case in their awareness for weeks, who have been monitoring for exactly the kind of news that the alert appeared to deliver, do not simply reset after a correction. They carry the experience of having been given information that was not true, and they carry it forward as a lens through which they evaluate future communications from the same source. The separate criticism of the sheriff's personal conduct intensifies this picture. A former superior of the current sheriff, someone who describes sustained, direct professional experience working alongside him, made public statements during an active investigation characterizing his personal conduct using words that point to character rather than policy: vindictive, bully. These are not abstract institutional criticisms. They are descriptions of how a specific individual operates in a position of authority, and they were offered by someone who claims firsthand professional knowledge of that individual's behavior. The department has offered no formal response to those statements. In a high-profile case, in a public environment, with a national audience paying attention, the absence of response is itself a form of communication. It says either that the department cannot construct a response that would be credible, or that it has calculated that engaging would amplify criticism beyond its current reach. Neither of those calculations reflects well on the department's current position. The federal investigation operates independently of these local dynamics in important structural ways. The FBI does not take direction from a county sheriff. Its laboratory work is subject to federal scientific and legal standards that are not affected by the credibility of local law enforcement. But investigations are not fully parallel processes. They require coordination. They require information sharing. They require a local agency that the public trusts enough to engage with and provide information to when asked. Reducing that trust has consequences that are difficult to quantify, but are real. And here, in the middle of this important development, if you have found this level of analysis valuable, subscribe and stay with this coverage as it continues. The second ransom note has changed the analytical framing of this case in a way that should not be understated, and that deserves sustained examination rather than a passing mention. When the first ransom note was recovered early in the investigation, it performed a specific function. It established the frame within which the investigation would operate. It confirmed that this was a kidnapping case, not a missing person case, not a voluntary departure, and not a tragedy without a human perpetrator. It confirmed that someone took Nancy Guthrie for a reason, and that reason involved the expectation of a financial response. That frame directed resources, shaped investigative priorities, and defined what resolution would require. A single ransom communication, however significant, remains ambiguous in several respects. It might represent the opening move in a sustained criminal operation. It might represent an impulsive act by someone who subsequently lost confidence and walked away from the situation. It might represent a manufactured element of a scenario that is not what it appears to be. One communication cannot exclude those possibilities with confidence. The second note excludes some of them. A person who sent an initial demand and then made a deliberate decision weeks later to send another has demonstrated something important. They have demonstrated commitment. They have demonstrated that this situation is not a single moment impulsive act that was subsequently abandoned. They have demonstrated that whatever calculation they made when they took Nancy Guthrie, whatever they believe they can gain from this situation, they have not given up on that calculation. The second note confirms an ongoing situation, and that confirmation changes what investigators are working with. Every ransom communication is forensic evidence in multiple dimensions: the physical characteristics of the communication, the material it is written or printed on, the instrument or technology used to produce it, the physical handling patterns visible on it. All of these carry extractable information. If the note was printed, the printer that produced it may leave identifiable microscopic characteristics in the output that can allow the specific device to be identified. If it was handwritten, pressure analysis and letter form examination can provide information about the writer. If it incorporated materials from other sources, those source materials become part of the trail. The linguistic content of the note is also analyzable beyond its surface meaning. Word choice, sentence structure, the presence or absence of specific grammatical patterns, the use of idiom or regional expression, all of these carry information about who produced the text. Forensic linguistics as a discipline has been applied in high-profile cases to compare texts against known writing samples from suspects and to identify linguistic markers that narrow the field of potential authors. Police responded to the second note by describing their action as a major move, language that implies concrete operational response rather than passive evidence intake. The detail of that response has not been made public. The detail of the simultaneous return to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood suggests that the note's content or context contained geographic information relevant to the area where she lived. Whether investigators received separate intelligence simultaneously that independently directed them back to the neighborhood, or whether the note itself pointed them there, is not publicly known. What is known is that the two things, the police response to the note and the return to the neighborhood, happened in close proximity. The combination of a second ransom note, the forensic analysis of hair samples, and the return of investigators to the neighborhood they already searched is a pattern that describes an investigation in which multiple threads may be moving toward the same location. If those threads are converging on a specific individual, and if the DNA analysis confirms what other investigative avenues are also pointing toward, the next development in this case could be swift and decisive. What is the realistic outlook for the Nancy Guthrie case from the position it occupies today, and what should that outlook look like when examined honestly rather than optimistically? The honest answer requires holding two things at once, and holding them simultaneously rather than resolving the tension between them. The first thing to hold is that the investigation is more evidence-rich, more forensically advanced, and more active at this point than it has been at any prior publicly visible moment in the case. The presence of potentially critical DNA evidence in a federal laboratory is not a minor development. It is the development that has the best chance of producing an identification. The second ransom note is not a complication. It is a resource. The return of investigators to the neighborhood is not a sign of repetition. It is a sign that geography remains relevant and that investigators are pursuing it. All of these are forward indicators in the truest sense. The second thing to hold is that 75 days is a long time. In abduction cases with a ransom component, the statistical reality of outcomes over time is something investigators understand and factor into their work, even when they do not discuss it publicly. Each week that passes without resolution is not simply a neutral unit of time. It carries weight. It changes the picture in ways that are not publicly quantifiable, but are real. No one connected to this case, inside or outside the investigation, is unaware of this. The urgency is felt even where it is not expressed. Holding those two realities together produces an honest assessment that looks something like this. The investigation is moving. It has produced evidence. The evidence is being processed by the most capable forensic resources available, and the timeline is governed entirely by the demands of that process. When the process produces a result, and if that result produces a match against a person investigators can identify, the response will be rapid. The groundwork will have been laid. The identification will be the missing piece that allows everything else to move. Savannah Guthrie's unexpected departure from her morning broadcast this week was visible and received the attention it would always receive in this context. Nothing about that departure has been confirmed to be connected to developments in the investigation, but its visibility is a reminder of the human reality that sits at the center of an investigation that is easy to discuss in terms of evidence and institutional process. There is a family, there is a daughter who goes to work every day in front of an audience that is aware of what her family is living through. There is a level of exposure in that reality that is its own particular burden. A journalist covering the case closely disclosed that there is a question he has been wanting to ask Savannah Guthrie that he has not yet been able to put to her. The nature of that question was not identified. Its existence is a signal that reporters with sustained professional proximity to this story believe the full picture of the case from the perspective of those closest to it has not yet been publicly shared. That may mean something significant. It may reflect a dimension of the investigation that has not been reported. Or it may reflect the simple reality that families in these situations carry private knowledge that is personal, painful, and not directly material to the investigative process. Without the question being asked and answered, it is not possible to know. What can be said about the case at day 75, looking at the complete available picture, is this. The investigation is active. The evidence is meaningful. The forensic work is being done at the highest level of available capacity. The local management of the case has produced failures that have damaged trust in ways that will take time to repair. The second ransom note confirms the situation is ongoing and that the person responsible is still present in some form. The neighborhood is being patrolled by investigators who believe the geography remains relevant. And the outcome, when it arrives, will be determined by what a federal laboratory finds and how quickly and decisively investigators can act on that finding. Nancy Guthrie is still waiting to be found. The investigation that is trying to find her is moving, but it is moving on a timeline that it does not fully control. The science is running. The case is open. And the next significant development could come at any point in the days ahead, or it could take weeks more. No one outside the investigation can say which. What can be said is that the analysis continues, and that when it produces a result, the people looking at it will be ready to act.